And if I'm the mayor of Shanghai or the provincial governor of Guangdong or the party secretary in Zhejiang, I go home and I say, okay, if I want to get the next job, the big boss told me I need to produce electric cars. And so I turn around and I call Tesla if I'm the mayor of Shanghai and I say, hey, Tesla, why don't you come here? I'll give you some free land and I'll give you some free electricity. Now, this represented a massive deflationary shock for China and for the world. It was actually a twin deflationary shock. The first shock was as you starve real estate of capital, these are the sort of unique characteristics of Chinese capitalism that I think most people who say, oh, well, everything is controlled by the central government who allocates resources, etc., just get completely wrong. BYD has 120,000 engineers in their R&D departments. Now, to put things in context, Tesla has 85,000 workers, not in their R&D department, just 85,000 workers, including the guys on the factory chain, tightening the bolts, etc. I think the first thing people get wrong is they look at China like a command economy because they see the name, Chinese Communist Party on the wall. And they assume this is a command economy, and therefore it can't work. So the assumption of most foreign investors is that if you argue that something is working in China, that must mean that you believe in command and control economies, and B, you're obviously wrong because command economies don't work, and so it's all gonna implode and blow up in your face. And I think, this is a fairly Manichaean approach, sort of black and white, which doesn't really correspond to an underlying economic reality. There's no doubt that China was that 50 years ago. When China was under Mao rule, you couldn't even decide what you were going to wear in the morning. Everybody had to wear the same thing. You couldn't decide where you were going to work. You couldn't decide, it was a total command and control economy. But the story really of the past 40, 50 years has been by and large a story of gradual deregulation. First you deregulate labor, then you deregulate land, then you deregulate natural resources. And now we're going through the phase of the deregulation of the world of capital, which, these things, it's never a straight line. It's always sort of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So I think that's the first thing people get wrong. I think the other thing people get wrong is they underestimate the level of competition that is prevalent around China. Essentially, competition at all levels, including, very importantly, between local governments, which is how you end up in the situation like you have right now, where if you look at China, I think you've got like 100 EV makers, because what happens is at the very top, Xi Jinping says, hey guys, we need to be the biggest EV producer in the world. And if I'm the mayor of Shanghai or the provincial governor of Guangdong or the party secretary in Zhejiang, I go home and I say, okay, if I want to get the next job, the big boss told me I need to produce electric cars. And so I turn around and I call Tesla if I'm the mayor of Shanghai and I say, hey, Tesla, why don't you come here? I'll give you some free land and I'll give you some free electricity. And then, the state next door, the province next door, Zhejiang says, oh, well, that worked out well for them. Let's do some of this. And so you end up in situations where, as soon as you have a successful business model, you might have 100 competitors funded by 100 different local authorities. And deep down, that's actually quite good for the consumer. Today in China, you can buy a great BYD car with full self-drive for $7,500. And so for the end consumer, it's a good deal. For the shareholders, it can be tough because, as soon as you have what you think is a pretty unique business, there's actually a competitor that gets subsidized right next door. And so, these are the sort of unique characteristics of Chinese capitalism that I think most people who say, oh, well, everything is controlled by the central government who allocates resources, etc., just get completely wrong. It's a very, very different competitive and domestic economic landscape over there. So I think to understand where you are today, you actually have to go back 7 or 8 years, because 7 or 8 years ago, you had a massive, massive shock to the Chinese economy. Essentially, the US imposed a semiconductor embargo on China, and the leadership felt, okay, the US just declared economic war on us. They transformed what was a trade war into a tech war, saying, look, we just don't want you to move up the value chain, and so we're going to block you from having access to the high-end semiconductors. Now, the government's reaction to this was essentially to say, okay, if they're blocking us from semiconductors today, tomorrow it could be chemical products, it could be auto parts, it could be anything. We have to totally, and it's not just the US, because the US can tell ASML not to sell us machines, it can tell TSMC not to sell us chips. So we have to totally de-Westernize our supply chains. And so starting in 2018, you see this very clearly in the lending data. The banks are essentially told by the government, guys, no more loans to real estate, no more loans to the consumer. All the money has to go into industry because we have to move up the industrial value chain much quicker than we thought we did before. It's a question of economic survival, that we need to build resiliency and independence in our industrial supply chains. And so you had a period for 7 years where all of China's savings, and those savings are massive, all of China's savings essentially went into industry. Now, this represented a massive deflationary shock for China and for the world. It was actually a twin deflationary shock. The first shock was as you starved real estate of capital, real estate prices went down, consumers tightened their belt, property developers went bust, commodity prices went down. This was the balance sheet recession that, everybody wrote about for 7 years. You couldn't pick up a copy of the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times without being told of this balance sheet recession. But the conclusion people took from it was the wrong one. Everybody looked at this and said, oh, this is Japan all over again. Except that it's not. Because in Japan, bank lending totally collapsed. In China, bank lending all went into industry. And what I think most people missed during those 7 years is how quickly China was moving up this value chain. Now, first, because it had unlimited access to capital, but also, and I think this is the part that everybody underestimates, is over that period, the Chinese workforce dramatically changed. What do I mean? I went to China to university in the mid-90s, and back then, China was graduating 350,000 university students a year. Today, China graduates 12 million university students a year. I mean, no country has gone in one generation, because I'm 52, has gone from 350 to 12 million. It's mind-boggling. So what you had, and by the way, roughly half of these guys are engineers and like science graduates. So just at the time when money was pouring into industry, essentially China was also producing just an insane number of engineers. So, you mentioned Rupert in the intro. I was with Rupert visiting BYD, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. I can't remember, 3 weeks ago maybe. BYD has 120,000 engineers in their R&D departments. Now, to put things in context, Tesla has 85,000 workers, not in their R&D department, just 85,000 workers, including the guys on the factory chain, tightening the bolts, etc. So BYD in their R&D department has 50% more workers than Tesla. So money absolutely poured into industry. And I think what the world missed was as all this money, as all these human resources poured in, China very rapidly moved up the value chain. If I told you in 2020, guys, by 2023, China will be exporting more cars than any other countries, you would have laughed in my face. And if I had said by 2025, you'll visit BYD and you'll wish you could buy those cars in your country, you would have been like, you would have kicked me out of the room and called me ridiculous. But yet here we are. And so what you've seen on cars, and I think people now realize it, because as soon as you travel, if you go to Brazil, if you go to South Africa, if you go to Saudi Arabia, you see the Chinese cars everywhere. What you've seen on cars, it's the same thing for tractors, it's the same thing for ships, it's the same thing for turbines, it's the same thing for nuclear power plants. It's essentially anything linked to automation and robotics, anything linked to transportation outside of jet planes, anything linked to energy storage, energy transmission, energy generation. By now, China has actually leapfrogged the West, where it's producing, thanks to all these people and all this money that's gone into it, It's producing better products at a cheaper price. So that was I think that the second big deflationary shock. So that brings you to today. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but that brings you to today. You have to understand where you are today. You've had this balance sheet recession, this deflationary shock for China, for the world, that was a direct result of essentially a geostrategic imperative. A geostrategic imperative of we need to cushion our economy against U.S. attacks. So, 2018, the U.S. punches China on the face. China has no choice but to take the punch. So it takes the punch. 21, Biden comes back to power. China thinks this is going to be better. It's actually worse. So China gets punched in the face again. Can't do anything except go to the gym, get jacked, get strong. So that by 25, when Trump comes back in, and this time Trump is pissed when he comes back in. And he doesn't just punch China. He punches Canada, he punches Mexico, he punches Europe, punches absolutely everybody because he's angry. The one country that is able to stand up because they've spent the past 7 years getting fit in the gym is China. So, U.S. goes to punch China, says, okay, you want to go? Let's go. Gloves off. Let's go. Let's do this. You tariff me, I tariff you. You embargo me, I embargo you. And that brings you to the meetings in Geneva, Kuala Lumpur, Seoul that we just had, where essentially the U.S. is forced to back off. The U.S. is forced to back off because you have the CEO of Raytheon that says in 3 weeks I can't produce missiles. You have Ford shutting down factories because they don't have access to rare earths. And so all of a sudden, the main method of pressure that the U.S. has is high-end semiconductors. And China with DeepSeek and with Quen has shown that actually we can do AI without the high-end semiconductors. That brings me to one of my favorite quotes. And I've written a piece about this. It's your listeners who follow me on Twitter can get that piece off my, I've opened it. It's a free distribution on my Twitter. If you go back to World War II, Rommel, the famous German tank commander, would say, our Tiger tanks is worth 4 of their Sherman tanks. The problem is the Americans always show up with 5. And this is where China is today. Today, everybody's running around saying, yeah, at AI, China can't compete because it doesn't have the NVIDIA chips. That's like saying the US can't compete with Germany because it can't produce as good a tank as the Sherman tank. When it comes to conflict, when it comes to challenges, there's a beauty in volume. And this is China's comparative advantage. The US's comparative advantage of World War II, which was essentially being the world's leading industrial power and being able to produce 10 Sherman tanks for every one German Tiger tank, that has now shifted to China. And so the US now essentially has no choice but to back down, which allows China to now embrace completely different sets of policies. Sorry, it's a very long-winded answer again, but it's very important to understand this, that 5 years ago, 7 years ago, if you were Xi Jinping, before you put on your pants in the morning, your concern was, how do I cushion my economy from U.S. attacks? That was your number one concern. Today, you no longer worry about this. That ship has sailed. In fact, now it's the U.S. that has to worry, how can I get rare earths? How do I make sure that my car plants don't shut down? How do I make sure that I can still produce missiles for Ukraine, for Israel? That is now, the concern has shifted. Instead, if you're China now, the concern is, my people aren't getting married anymore. They're not having kids. My birth rate is collapsing because, the balance sheet recession has hit the millennials, your 25 to 40-year-olds. It's hit the millennials really, really hard. They've been the bag holders in the balance sheet recession. And so now you have to essentially help those guys out. And so now if you look at the 5-year plan of 5 years ago, it was all about increasing supply. Now the 5-year plan is all about increasing demand. And so today you turn around and China is now running budget deficits of 10% of GDP, second biggest economy in the world. And I think this matters, not just for China, of course, consequences, China's having a bull market, et cetera. But globally, even if you say, I don't care about what's happening in China, I don't want to hear about it, I hate the place, even if you're the most neoconservative of neoconservatives, the reality remains that for 7 years, China was a huge deflationary drag for the world. Uh, it followed a very deflationary policy, which allowed the US, Europe, Japan to follow very easy fiscal, very easy monetary policies because China was such a deflationary drag. The days of China being that deflationary drag are now going to be behind us. Now, I'm not saying, that China is going to be this big inflationary shock, but at the margin, China's deflationary impact is now abating. They're following much more reflationary policies. And as they follow reflationary policies, you are seeing the impact on the market. You're seeing the impact on the market through the outperformance of emerging market debt, the outperformance of emerging market equities, the outperformance of metals, the outperformance of miners. The one reflationary trade that hasn't really worked yet is energy. But if that does, then we move into a very, very different investment environment.